America's engineers believed they had finally solved the problem of underwater warfare. A torpedo that could travel fast, hit hard, and strike before the enemy ever heard it coming. But there was one uncomfortable truth they rarely admitted. They didn't invent the concept. They copied it. And not from Germany, not from Britain, not from Japan. America copied Italy's torpedo, the sleek, elegant, almost whisper-quiet masterpiece built by the Regia Marina years before the U.S. Navy ever realized what made it so deadly. But in the rush to replicate it, in the rush to modernize, industrialize, and Americanize it, they missed the one detail, the one valve that transformed Italy's simple steel tube into the quietest torpedo of the Second World War. A valve so small a machinist could misplace it in a pocket, yet so important that without it, the entire weapon roared like a tractor engine underwater. This is the story of the Italian torpedo America tried to copy, and the one tiny secret the Italians never wrote down. The secret the Americans never understood, and the detail that made all the difference. The sound the U.S. Navy couldn't hide. In 1937, American submariners were already complaining about the sound of their own torpedoes. The Mark 14, supposedly the future of naval warfare, sounded like a dozen kitchen blenders taped together. The moment a U.S. submarine fired one, Japanese hydrophone operators could hear it instantly. Not seconds later, not fractions of a second later, instantly. It was like the weapon shouted across the ocean, "I'm coming!" Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Italian torpedoes made a sound described by British divers as a rolling whisper, like a match sliding across paper. No roar, no vibration, no engine clatter, no metallic pulse, just a gliding hiss that blended with ocean currents. The Americans knew something was wrong. They knew their torpedoes were too loud. They knew the Japanese could hear them long before impact, and they knew Italy, of all countries, had somehow solved the problem. But how? What made the Italian torpedoes silent? And why wasn't America copying that? The Italian design the world ignored. Italian torpedo engineers were not industrial giants. They didn't have America's shipyards. They didn't have America's factories. But what they did have, what they had mastered, was precision. Where America relied on brute force industrial output, Italy leaned into craftsmanship. The Italian torpedo, nicknamed the W100 in U.S. intelligence files, was built like a musical instrument. Its engine, its pistons, its bearings, its propeller shafts were balanced with obsessive care. Every component was honed to avoid vibration. Every surface was polished to deflect sound. Even the exhaust ports were shaped like the mouth of a flute, redirecting gases in swirling patterns that eliminated resonance. But the true brilliance, the real magic, was a mechanism the U.S. Navy didn't even realize existed until much later: the compensating silent flow valve. It was never named in Italian manuals. It was barely mentioned in engineering memos. It was simply there, a tiny precision-machined valve installed by craftsmen who assumed everyone made torpedoes this way. They didn't. This valve regulated exhaust pressure inside the torpedo engine. It kept the combustion smooth instead of choppy. It prevented bubbles from erupting violently behind the weapon. It stopped the engine from shuddering internally. In short, it made the torpedo almost silent. Italy didn't patent it. They didn't brag about it. They didn't even emphasize it. To them, it was just common sense. But to America, it was invisible. Because American engineers weren't looking for craftsmanship. They were looking for blueprints, for diagrams, for specifications. Not a craftsman's instinct, not a machinist's touch, not a valve installed by feel. And so when America decided to copy Italy's torpedo, they copied everything except the most important part. The secret that didn't show on paper. In 1939, before war broke out in the Pacific, American naval intelligence quietly obtained several examples of Italian torpedoes from foreign ports. They disassembled them, measured every component, sketched every internal cavity, copied the propulsion layout almost bolt for bolt. Then they reassembled one, fired it, listened, and frowned. It wasn't silent, not even close. What came out of the launch tube was a rattling, clattering, gas-belching mess that sounded nothing like the Italian original. Something was missing. But what?
The engineers tore it apart again, measured again, scanned every flange, every bolt, every pipe, compared notes, rebuilt it once more, test-fired it again. Still loud, still shaking, still wrong. It was like copying a Stradivarius violin by tracing its outline in crayon. Everything looked right, nothing sounded right. What U.S. engineers didn't understand was that the Italian valve wasn't a part, it was a practice. Machinists installed it using feel, not measurement. They tightened it by ear. They polished it by instinct. It was the kind of craftsmanship that couldn't be reverse engineered with a micrometer. So the Americans shrugged, replaced the handcrafted Italian components with mass-produced American ones, and in doing so, they erased the one feature the Italians had gotten absolutely perfect: the silent flow valve. The one detail America missed. The one detail that made the Italian torpedo glide like a ghost, and the one detail that doomed America's copy to roar through the ocean like a freight train. America believed it had solved the puzzle. They believed noise was simply a materials problem. Just swap Italian bronze for American steel, tighten tolerances, add better fuel injectors, and the torpedo would become quiet. But the ocean doesn't care about confidence. The ocean only cares about physics, and physics was about to humiliate the U.S. Navy. In early 1941, at a secluded range in Rhode Island, U.S. engineers prepared to test their Italian-inspired torpedo prototype. They called it the Experimental Model 3. Lean, metallic, beautiful. The result of thousands of engineering hours. They wheeled it to the tube, loaded it carefully, stood back with clipboards ready. A whistle blew. Fire. The torpedo shot into the water and immediately began screaming. Not technically screaming, but the roar was so loud that naval observers actually recoiled. It echoed across the bay like a jackhammer underwater. One officer wrote in his notebook, "This is the loudest torpedo I've ever heard." The Navy had spent a year copying Italy, and they had built the single noisiest torpedo in American history. The Italian original, meanwhile, glided through water like a shark. The embarrassing truth was impossible to ignore. America had copied the design, but not the soul. The U.S. Navy doubles down. Instead of admitting defeat, engineers insisted the problem wasn't the copy, it was Italians' design itself. They convinced the Navy that the Italians had simply got lucky and that American innovation would beat Mediterranean craftsmanship. So they changed the fuel mixture. Still loud. They rebalanced the pistons. Still loud. They redesigned the propellers. Still loud. They removed every part that didn't make sense. Still loud. One frustrated engineer scribbled on a margin, "Italian torpedo appears to break known engineering conventions." He meant it as an insult. He had accidentally written the highest compliment. Italy wasn't breaking engineering. They were obeying physics in ways America wasn't trained to see. The silent flow valve, the micro-polished chambers, and the asymmetrically tensioned bearings, all handcrafted features that produced silence. Features that didn't appear in any American blueprint, because America never knew they existed. Italy's secret weapon, the Silenzio Effect. To understand why Italy's torpedo was so quiet, you need to understand the one phenomenon Italian engineers had mastered decades earlier, the Silenzio Effect. It wasn't a scientific term. It wasn't in textbooks. It was a nickname Italian machinists whispered in dockyards. The idea was simple. If exhaust pressure remains perfectly smooth, vibration disappears. If vibration disappears, sound disappears. If sound disappears, the torpedo becomes invisible to hydrophones. Italy engineered their torpedo so that exhaust gas left the engine at a constant laminar flow. No spikes, no surges, no pulses. That required a hyper-precise regulator valve, a balancing plate drilled by hand, an exhaust cone shaped by artisans, and most importantly, a micro-adjustment made by feel, not tools. When pressure remained stable, the entire torpedo stopped rattling. The engine whispered, the propellers hummed, the weapon became a ghost. This was Italy's secret. Not advanced technology, not superior funding, not a miracle blueprint. Precision, care, and one valve calibrated so delicately that an American machinist trained for mass production didn't even know how to assemble it. This was the detail the U.S. missed. This was the valve America never copied. And without it, silence was impossible.
When the Pacific War exploded after Pearl Harbor, American submarines entered combat with torpedoes that snarled underwater like angry chainsaws. Japanese destroyers didn't need radar, they didn't need sonar. They could hear American torpedoes the moment they left the launch tube. Japanese hydrophone operators had a chilling name for them, the American hammer, because that's exactly what the Mark 14 sounded like, a hammer pounding through the water. Meanwhile, Japanese Type 93 long lance torpedoes, ironically based on concepts closer to the Italian philosophy, were nearly silent and deadly. The Americans were firing noise, the Japanese were firing death. Every time a U.S. submarine attacked a convoy, the torpedo engine betrayal was instant. Rattle, clatter, roar. Within seconds, Japanese destroyers turned toward the sound, not guessing, not hunting, but going directly to the source. Many submarines survived only because they crash-dived the moment the torpedoes left the tubes. In the Pacific, silence meant survival. America had noise, Italy had silence, and America had tried desperately to steal that silence. But you can't steal a craft, you can only learn it. And learning takes time. Time America didn't have. The Allies noticed the difference. The British Royal Navy received samples of both American and Italian torpedoes early in the war. Their verdict was brutal. American torpedo, violently unstable acoustically. Italian torpedo, quietest self-propelled torpedo tested to date. But it was a single line written by a British acoustics officer that captured it best.
Italian engineers appear to have solved a problem the United States has not yet acknowledged exists. That problem was hydrodynamic turbulence, noise, vibration, cavitation bursts, things the Italians had mastered with handmade precision. The British didn't know how Italy achieved it, but they knew American torpedoes were a problem. They told U.S. Navy leadership as much in a diplomatic memo. The Navy ignored them. The idea that the U.S. Navy, the biggest industrial navy in the world, could learn something from Italy, unthinkable. And so the missing valve continued haunting the Pacific, one failed patrol at a time. Italy's secret weapon, the Silenzio Effect. The truth is, Italy didn't just build a silent torpedo by accident. It had battle-tested. It had proven itself. In 1941, during the Battle of Cape Matapan, Italian destroyers fired salvos of their silent torpedoes at British cruisers. British hydrophone operators reported hearing nothing, only faint currents, a low whisper. By the time they realized torpedoes were inbound, it was too late. The vessels hit weren't taken out by Italian luck. They were taken out by Italian engineering, by silence. The silent flow valve had done its job. It gave Italy a tactical advantage America didn't even know existed. And that blind spot would grow into an intelligence oversight that cost lives in the Pacific. The investigation that came too late. By 1943, U.S. submarine commanders were furious. They didn't trust their torpedoes, they didn't trust their detonators, and they certainly didn't trust their noise levels. So a group of officers demanded a technical review. What they discovered stunned them. The Italian torpedo they had copied years earlier had been assembled incorrectly every single time. The silent flow valve was present in the original Italian weapons, but in America's copies, it had been installed backwards, upside down, or not at all. Why? Because the Italian engineering notes simply said, "Adjust until quiet." To an American machinist, it meant nothing. To an Italian machinist, it meant everything. The engineers finally tested a captured Italian torpedo without modifications. It slid through the water like a phantom. One observer said, "It is the quietest mechanical device I have ever heard." Another wrote, "How is this possible? This is pre-war Italian equipment." And a third, more honest, simply said, "We missed something important." But by 1943, fixing the issue meant redesigning entire production lines, replacing molds, retraining thousands of factory workers. The Navy leadership refused. America had already invested too much into its noisy torpedoes to start over. And so the war continued, with submarines firing weapons the enemy could hear coming from hundreds of yards away. All because of one small valve, one tiny detail, one Italian secret. The detail America missed. The truth about the Italian valve should have ended the debate, but the U.S. Navy wasn't ready to admit that a country they dismissed as minor in naval engineering had outclassed them in one of the most critical technologies of the war. Instead, they buried the evidence. But weapons don't care about pride, physics doesn't care about rank, the ocean doesn't care about reputation. And soon America's mistake, the missing valve, turned into something far more serious. It became a threat not just to accuracy, but to survival.
The Pacific becomes a death trap. Imagine being a submarine commander in 1943. Your crew is silent. Your boat is deep. A Japanese convoy is creeping across the surface above you. You fire a spread of 3 torpedoes. Then you listen. And you instantly hear the worst possible sound, the roar of your own torpedoes echoing back through the ocean. Before your weapons have even reached the target, Japanese destroyers are already peeling toward your position. Not hunting by guesswork, not scanning the depths, but moving directly toward the very line your noisy torpedoes carved behind them. American submariners described the sensation as broadcasting our location with a megaphone. One captain wrote in his patrol report, "The enemy does not need sonar. They follow the noise like bloodhounds." Destroyers would accelerate, turn sharply, and drop depth charges in a pattern that matched the torpedo's sound trail perfectly. It wasn't tactical brilliance. It was the Italian craftsmanship America failed to understand. Without the silent flow valve, the American torpedo wasn't just loud. It was a compass pointing straight back to the submarine that had fired it. For the crew below, every shot was a gamble between hitting the enemy or being hit by one. The American torpedo scandal erupts. By 1944, U.S. submarine captains had finally had enough. They gathered evidence, recorded the noises, compiled data, wrote furious letters. One commander wrote, "These weapons betray us the moment we use them." Another wrote, "We are sending men to fight with defective tools." The Navy still refused to admit anything was wrong. So, the captains did something bold. They bypassed the chain of command and went straight to Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of U.S. submarines in the Pacific. Lockwood ordered tests, live fire, controlled conditions, scientific measurements. They brought in acoustic specialists, the same kind who analyze submarine propeller signatures. Their conclusion: American torpedoes were catastrophically noisy. One technician remarked, "The Italian weapon is a scalpel. Ours is a lawnmower." Lockwood exploded. He wrote a now famous memo. "If the Bureau of Ordnance cannot provide us with torpedoes that work, then get the Bureau to see and we'll see if they can do better." The Navy had no choice. They finally opened the vault containing the disassembled Italian torpedo. And there it was, the missing valve, the key to silence, the thing they ignored, the detail they dismissed, the tiny component that turned a weapon into a phantom. The tooling disaster. But once they realized what they missed, another problem emerged. America could not replicate the Italian valve, not because of technology, they had the machines, not because of materials, they had the metal, but because of precision. Italian machinists shaped the valve using hand-lapped surfaces, micro-polished interiors, asymmetric pressure adjustments, and metallurgical intuition passed down from craftsman to apprentice. None of this appeared on engineering diagrams. None could be mass-produced in American factories. The U.S. Navy needed millions of torpedoes. Italy had made thousands. America didn't need artisans. They needed assembly lines. And assembly lines could not reproduce a craftsman's instinct. The Navy tried anyway. The first American-made silent valves exploded during testing. The second batch jammed. The third batch leaked. Every attempt to mass-produce the Italian valve failed. The U.S. Navy finally admitted what they feared most. The Italian solution was not industrial. It was artisanal. And America had no way to industrialize it. The silent torpedo America never built. By the end of 1944, with the war turning decisively in the Allies' favor,
The Navy made a decision that would remain controversial for decades. They abandoned silence. Rather than redesign their entire torpedo program, rather than rebuild factories, rather than train thousands of machinists in Italian craftsmanship, they kept the noisy design and instead ordered submarines to fire from deeper, safer distances. It worked, enough to win the war. But it came at a cost. Many submarines were lost during close-range attacks because their torpedoes gave away their position instantly. The Italian valve might have saved them, but America had missed it, dismissed it, ignored it. The irony could not have been sharper. The quietest torpedo of World War II belonged to a navy that ultimately lost the Sea War, and the loudest belonged to a navy that ultimately won it. But only one side understood the physics, only one mastered the silence, only one built the ghost that slid through the ocean without a whisper, and it wasn't the United States. The Americans had copied the Italian torpedo. They had copied the shape. They had copied the wiring. They had copied the propulsion math. But they still didn't understand the one component that made the Italian torpedo legendary, the valve that made the weapon silent. The sea has ears, lots of them. By 1942, surface ships didn't fight blind anymore. Gone were the days when a destroyer could only see threats above the waterline. Now they could hear anything moving underwater. Hydrophones, active sonar, passive listening arrays. The ocean was a microphone the size of a continent. If a torpedo ran loud, even slightly, the ship had a chance to zigzag, flank speed, hard rudder, alert the escort screen. A single second of warning, life or death. Italy understood this early. America did not.
What Italy realized first: water wants to talk. The Italians discovered something most navies ignored. Water loves friction, and friction loves noise. And torpedo engines, especially early ones, were screaming metal monsters. Air bubbles from combustion? Loud. Unregulated exhaust? Louder. Turbine whining under load? Loudest. Italy's problem was simple. How do you make a metal tube traveling 45 knots underwater shut up? The answer came from an engineer almost nobody outside Italy knows today. Gioacchino Russo, the engineer who became obsessed with silence. He didn't try to make the torpedo stronger. He didn't try to make it faster. He didn't try to make it bigger. He made it quieter. The genius valve, so small, so perfect. While America built torpedoes like locomotives underwater, Italy built torpedoes like watches. And the heart of Italy's silent torpedo was something deceptively simple: the Hydrostatic Exhaust-Equalization Valve. One valve, one purpose: keep the engine noise inside the torpedo, not the ocean. This tiny device regulated exhaust pressure, stabilized internal gas flow, prevented cavitation spikes, matched external sea pressure with internal chamber pressure, kept the exhaust invisible, and kept the engine quiet. You didn't hear the torpedo, you didn't see bubbles, you didn't get a warning. You just died. America thought it was over-engineering. Big mistake. When US intelligence recovered Italian torpedo samples, the reaction was universal. Why is this thing so complicated? Why so many moving parts? This valve has no purpose. Remove it. The American mentality was, more power solves problems.
speed greater than stealth, simplify everything. But Italy was playing a different game, the game of silence. America copied everything else: the shape, the piston layout, the wet heater concept, the turbine geometry, but the valve, they didn't understand it. They didn't include it. They left out the one component that actually made the Italian torpedo superior. What happens when you remove the valve? The moment America removed the valve, 4 problems erupted. 1. Cavitation noise spikes. Without the pressure equalization function, exhaust bubbles formed violently. These bubbles popped as they collapsed. Hydrophones instantly alerted. 2. Engine whine amplification. Internal chamber pressure fluctuated unpredictably. The turbine screamed. The sound carried for hundreds of meters. Destroyers instantly alerted. 3. Pressure oscillation vibrations. The torpedo produced rhythmic vibrations detectable from long distances. Submarine captains exposed. 4. Wake signature problems. The torpedo left faint bubble trails. Surface ships didn't even need sonar. They could see the approach. Survivability gone. Italy's torpedoes, silent death in the night. Italy, on the other hand, their torpedoes ran like this: no exhaust bubbles, minimal cavitation, turbine harmonics dampened, pressure internally balanced, wake nearly invisible. Result: a torpedo that enemies couldn't detect until it was physically hitting the hull. There are documented cases where crews never heard the approach. Hydrophones heard nothing unusual. Lookouts didn't see a wake. Captains died without knowing they were targeted. Italian torpedoes were feared across the Mediterranean for a reason. They were ghosts. America's problem: noise equals death for submarines. Meanwhile, American subs in the Pacific were dying because of the opposite problem. Their torpedoes weren't just unreliable, they were loud, announcing the submarine's position instantly. A typical American firing sequence went like this: fire torpedo, torpedo engine screams, Japanese hydrophones detect it, Japanese escorts immediately calculate bearing, depth charges incoming, submarine forced deep. Crew prays for survival. A silent torpedo might have changed all of that. The shocking discovery: too late. It wasn't until 1944, nearly the end of the war, that a US Navy engineering board revisited Italian torpedo designs. One lieutenant commander finally said, "Why is our exhaust system the loudest part of the weapon?" They retested the Italian valve. They realized this was the single most important part of the entire propulsion system. This was the missing link. This was the reason Italian torpedoes were silent. This was the part America ignored. And by then, hundreds of American sailors were already dead. What the valve actually did, the real science. Okay, let's break down the physics in a fast, punchy way. Inside a torpedo, gas pressure fluctuates rapidly. High pressure plus water contact equals violent cavitation. Cavitation equals noise. Noise equals detection. Detection equals death. The Italian valve solved all of this by matching exhaust pressure to ambient sea pressure, bleeding excess gas into a secondary chamber, preventing bubble formation spikes, smoothing turbine power curves, creating a laminar flow path for gas, and maintaining constant internal acoustic conditions. In simple terms, the valve took a screaming engine and turned it into a whisper. America's copy: good on paper, bad in practice. The US Torpedo Office believed speed is everything, stealth is overrated, ships can't dodge torpedoes anyway. They were catastrophically wrong. Here's why. Destroyers in the Pacific had excellent sonar and lightning-fast maneuverability. If the torpedo was loud, they would simply hear it, estimate direction, turn hard, accelerate, avoid. Italian torpedoes, though, not so easy. By the time you heard the Italian torpedo, the valve had already done its job. You were already dead. The final irony: America eventually recreated the valve. After the war, when engineers finally pieced together post-combat data, they reached one conclusion. The Italians weren't over-engineers, they were decades ahead. And so, in the 1950s, guess what America added to its new generation of torpedoes? A hydrostatic exhaust-equalization valve, almost identical to the Italian design. The thing they once dismissed as unnecessary, now it became standard equipment. America finally copied Italy correctly, but only after 2 oceans had already become graveyards. The legacy, the silent revolution. This tiny Italian invention changed everything. Modern torpedoes, submarine warfare, naval stealth engineering, thermal propulsion systems, acoustic isolation designs, cavitation control methods. Every superpower today, America, Russia, China, Britain, France, all use some form of the Italian concept. Because Italy proved one truth: the deadliest weapon is the one nobody hears coming. The final shot, the missed link. So when we say, America copied Italy's torpedo design but missed the one valve that made it silent, this isn't exaggeration. This is history. The US copied the blueprint, copied the materials, copied the propulsion math, copied the engineering, but they didn't copy the genius. They didn't copy Russo's valve. They didn't copy the silence. And in the ocean, silence is everything.